Sweat beaded beneath her heavy veil, smelling faintly of hairspray and nervous anxiety. Harley clutched the synthetic lilies so tight the plastic stems dug into her palms. Across the altar, Peter wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the exit, his jaw working like he was chewing glass. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked the stifling silence of the chapel. "I can't." And from the back pew, a dark, low chuckle drifted forward. "Good." Dust motes danced in the thick, humid air of St. Jude's. The church's air conditioning had broken an hour before, the ceremony leaving the space, smelling of stale floor wax, damp wool, from the groomsmen's rented suits, and the suffocatingly sweet odor of wilting gardenias. Harley stood frozen on the altar steps. Her feet throbbed. She had chosen 3-inch heels. She couldn't walk in a concession to her mother's relentless nagging about posture. The lace of her bodice was cheap, rigid, and currently scraping a raw line against her collarbone with every shallow breath she took. She stared at Peter. He was sweating heavily, a fat drop rolling down his temple and into his perfectly styled brown hair. He smelled sour. Not just nervous Groom sour, but the sharp, acrid scent of genuine visceral panic. He hadn't looked at her eyes once since she reached the end of the aisle. "What do you mean you can't?" Harley asked. Her voice didn't shake. It came out flat, hollowed out by the sheer absurdity of the moment. She didn't feel the devastating heartbreak the movies promised. She felt an overwhelming, humiliating rush of practicality. "We put an $8,000 deposit on the reception hall. The catering is already carving the prime rib. I can't do this, Harley." Peter stepped back. The sole of his polished Oxford scraped against the marble altar step. A harsh, scraping sound that echoed up to the vaulted ceiling. "I'm sorry, I have to go." Behind them, the priest cleared his throat, a wet, awkward sound. In the pews, the silence broke. It didn't erupt. It fractured into 100 buzzing whispers, a hive of 200 guests shifting on hard wooden benches. Harley felt a hot flush of embarrassment crawl up her neck, staining her chest red above the white neckline. She looked at Peter's hands. They were trembling violently. He wasn't having cold feet about a lifetime of marriage. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a ledge, watching the concrete rise up to meet him. "Peter," Harley said, lowering her voice, dropping the lilies to her side. The plastic stems snapped faintly against her thigh. "If you walk out those doors, you don't come back. We are paying for this. My parents remortgaged their house. They shouldn't have done that." He whispered, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the nave. He took another step back, then another. He turned away from her, abandoning the altar, abandoning the priest, abandoning 3 years of Sunday morning coffees and shared electric bills. He started a fast, stumbling walk down the center aisle. Harley didn't cry. Her jaw locked. She watched his retreating back, feeling a cold, heavy stone settle in her gut. The humiliation was a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. She wanted to rip the veil from her hair. She wanted to scream about the deposit. Before Peter could make it 10 yards down the red carpet, a heavy, rhythmic thud echoed from the back of the church. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Leather soles striking the floorboards with the kind of weight that commanded absolute, terrified silence. The whispering in the pews died instantly. A man stepped out from the shadows of the vestibule, blocking the center aisle. He didn't look like he belonged in St. Jude's. He didn't belong in daylight. He wore a charcoal suit that absorbed the dim light cut close to a wide, heavily muscled frame. His tie was loose, a deep blood-bruise purple. Harley squinted through the cheap tulle of her veil. The man stopped, forcing Peter to a violent, skidding halt. "Going somewhere, Petey?" the man asked. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, gravel-scraped baritone that carried perfectly through the dead air of the church. It smelled almost hallucinatorily of cold asphalt and burnt tobacco. Peter shrank. He didn't just cower. His entire body seemed to deflate, folding inward. "Cassian," he choked out. The name sounded like a death rattle. Cassian. Harley didn't know the name, but the reaction it drew from her ex-groom told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't an uncle from out of town. This wasn't a rejected lover. Cassian reached out and grabbed Peter by the throat of his rented tuxedo. He didn't yank him. He just held him there, bunching the cheap fabric in a fist the size of a cinder block. Cassian tilted his head, his dark eyes sliding past Peter's terrified face, tracing the length of the aisle up the altar steps until they locked onto Harley. His eyes were a flat, unreadable black. There was a faint, jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow, pale against his olive skin. He looked at her white dress, the dropped bouquet, the flush of angry red on her chest. Cassian released Peter with a shove that sent the smaller man stumbling into a pew, cracking his hip against the wood with a dull thud. Peter scrambled to stay upright, whimpering softly. "You owe me 2.5 million, Peter," Cassian said, his eyes never leaving Harley. "You told me you needed a week. You didn't mention you were throwing a party." Harley's stomach plummeted. 2.5 million. The number didn't even make sense. Peter was a mid-level accountant. He complained about the price of organic chicken. I was going to pay," Peter stammered, gripping the back of a pew. "Her family. They have some money. The gifts. The gifts," Cassian repeated, his voice devoid of amusement. "You were going to pay off a cartel debt with a few toasters and envelopes of cash from your aunt." A collective gasp swept through the church. Harley's mother, sitting in the front row, let out a choked sob. Harley couldn't breathe. The corset of her dress was suddenly a vice. Cartel debt. Peter. The man standing on the red carpet. It was a collision of two worlds that had no business occupying the same zip code. Cassian finally began to walk toward the altar. He moved with a heavy, predatory grace. The guests shrank back into their seats as he passed, pulling their knees in, desperate not to brush against his suit. He stopped at the bottom of the altar steps. Up close, Harley could see the fine webbing of exhaustion around his eyes, the dark shadow of stubble on his jaw. He didn't look like a cartoon villain. He looked like a man who worked long, brutal hours and had zero patience left for the day. "He's useless to me," Cassian stated, looking up at Harley. He spoke to her as if they were discussing a broken appliance. "A coward. Can't shoot him here. Messy." Harley's throat was drier than dust. She forced her tongue to work. "Then what do you want?" Cassian studied her. He took in the rigid set of her jaw, the distinct lack of tears, the white-knuckle grip she had on the layers of her tulle skirt. A muscle feathered in his jaw. "Collateral," he said simply. He took the final 3 steps up the altar. The priest backed away so fast he tripped over the hem of his robes. Cassian stopped inches from Harley. He was a foot taller than her, even in her punishing heels. The smell of him was overwhelming, now expensive wool spearmint, and the sharp metallic tang of something that smelled suspiciously like gun oil. He didn't ask for her hand. He reached out his large, calloused fingers, wrapping around her wrist. His skin was incredibly warm. Rough. The grip was a steel manacle not tight enough to bruise, but impossible to break. The groom refused the bride. Cassian said, his voice, dropping an octave, meant only for her and the empty space left by Peter. He stepped closer, his chest brushing the stiff lace of her bodice. "Then she's mine." Harley yanked her arm. It was an involuntary muscle spasm, a pure fight-or-flight reflex. Cassian's arm didn't even budge. His grip remained steady, an anchor chaining her to the marble floor. "Let go of me!" She hissed the words, vibrating with a sudden, localized fury. The shock of the ruined wedding was evaporating. burning off rapidly to reveal a deep, jagged anger. Cassian looked down at her hand, trapped in his, and then back up to her eyes. No, it wasn't a threat. It was a statement of a physical law like gravity. "I am not a piece of property," Harley said, her voice trembling now, not with fear, but with adrenaline. "I don't know anything about his debt. I don't know you. You cannot just walk into a church and take a person." "I just did," Cassian replied. He glanced over his shoulder. Peter was still cowering near the fifth pew. The guests were statues, 200 people, paralyzed by the surreal violence of the intrusion. Harley's father was half standing, his face purple, but a harsh glare from the dark-suited man who had silently filed in behind Cassian kept him pinned to his seat. "Peter!" Harley yelled. The sound tore at her throat. Tell him I have nothing to do with this." Peter looked at her. His eyes were red-rimmed, pathetic. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked from Harley to Cassian, then bolted. He scrambled over the legs of a terrified bridesmaid and ran for the side exit of the church, the heavy wooden door banging shut behind him. The echo of the slamming door rang through the nave. Harley stared at the empty space where her fiancé had been. A bitter, acidic laugh scraped its way up her throat. She clamped her free hand over her mouth to stop the sound, but a harsh breath escaped anyway. 3 years. 3 years of compromise, of dull movie nights, of convincing herself that safe and boring was better than volatile. Safe and boring had just sold her to the mob and run out the side door. Cassian watched her carefully. He was cataloguing her reaction. He noted the absence of hysterics, the rigid spine, the bitter laugh. "He's a rat," Cassian said, his voice surprisingly quiet, devoid of the theatrical menace he had used on Peter. "Rats run." "And what are you?" Harley snapped, turning her glare back to him. "A debt collector with a flair for the dramatic." Cassian's eyes narrowed slightly. A flicker of something that might have been amusement, or perhaps just surprise, crossed his features. "I'm the man who owns your life, until that $2.5 million is recouped. I make $55,000 a year managing a logistics warehouse," Harley said, her cynical brain doing the math, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "It will take me 45 years to pay that off, assuming I don't eat or pay rent. You won't be paying it off with a salary." Cassian tugged gently on her wrist, forcing her to take a step forward. Her heel caught on the hem of her heavy dress, and she stumbled. Before she could faceplant onto the altar, Cassian's free arm shot out, a solid bar of muscle catching her around the waist. The physical contact was jarring. Through the stiff layers of taffeta and lace, she felt the hard heat of his body. He righted her effortlessly, his hand lingering on her waist for a fraction of a second longer than strictly necessary. "Can you walk in those?" he asked, nodding at her shoes. "I walk down the aisle just fine." She bit back, stepping out of his hold. "Then walk." He released her wrist, but his presence was a physical barrier crowding her. He gestured toward the main doors. "We're leaving." Harley looked out at the sea of faces. Her mother was weeping into her hands. Her father looked utterly broken, his fists clenched uselessly on his lap. Her bridesmaids were clustered together, wide-eyed, clutching their bouquets like shields. Nobody was going to stop him. The realization settled over her like a freezing rain. They were ordinary people. You don't fight a man like Cassian with angry shouts and threatening to call the police. The police would just draw chalk outlines. "If I go with you," Harley said, keeping her voice low so the congregation couldn't hear, "you leave them alone. My family. You don't touch them." Cassian looked at the crowd with mild disgust. "They're not my concern." "You are. Move." Harley bent down. She picked up the ridiculous heavy train of her dress, gathering the scratchy fabric into a massive, awkward bundle in her arms. She didn't look at the priest. She didn't look at her parents. She couldn't bear the pity, or worse, the relief in their eyes, that she was the one taking the fall, not them. She turned and began the long walk back down the red carpet. Cassian walked half a step behind her. She could hear the heavy thud of his shoes, feel the displacement of air as his large frame moved in her wake. It was a funeral march masquerading as a recessional. As they passed the third pew, Harley smelled it again, the faint, lingering, sour scent of Peter's sweat. She stepped over a crumpled program he had dropped. She wasn't a bride anymore. She was a ledger entry, a piece of collateral. They reached the vestibule. The heavy oak doors were pushed open by two of Cassian's men, large, silent statues in tailored suits. The oppressive, humid air of the church gave way to the sharp, blinding glare of a Tuesday afternoon in the city. The heat of the asphalt rolled up in waves. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, the normal sounds of a world that had completely upended itself in the span of 10 minutes. The glaring Tuesday sun hit Harley like a physical blow. The humid, stale air of St. Jude's was instantly replaced by the oppressive heat of the asphalt and the distant wail of a siren. A black, heavily tinted SUV sat idling at the curb, its exhaust rumbling low in her chest. Cassian stopped at the top of the concrete steps, letting her have her moment of terror. "I'm going to throw up," Harley stated, staring blindly at the dark interior of the vehicle. "Do it on the concrete, not in the car," he replied flatly. The sheer callousness acted like a slap, grounding her. She swallowed hard, wrestling her massive, cheap tulle skirt into the frigid, leather-scented cabin. It was a logistical nightmare. She had to shove the stiff petticoats in first, the white fabric aggressively swallowing the back seat. Cassian slid in beside her, yanking a swath of lace from beneath his thigh with an annoyed grunt. "Who designed this?" he muttered, brushing a rogue piece of tulle off his dark slacks. "It's like sitting next to a pastry." It was on sale. Harley bit back, gripping the door handle, as the SUV pulled smoothly away from the curb. She watched the blur of brick buildings, the world carrying on outside, completely ignorant of the fact that she was currently collateral. "Where are we going?" "Do you issue receipts for human trafficking?" Cassian paused, his thumb hovering over his matte black phone. Slowly he turned his head. His dark eyes were cold, calculating. "I am not a trafficker. I own debt. Your ex-fiancé decided to use the money I fronted him to cover bad investments. And then he sent me an email yesterday." Cassian lowered his voice, the sound dangerous and soft. "He told me if I gave him another month, he'd sign over the deed to your parents' house. He forged their signatures on the collateral forms." Harley's stomach went into a violent freefall. "My parents' house," she whispered. "The house they remortgaged to pay for your cake." Cassian confirmed, looking back at his phone. If I had sent my men to collect on Peter, he would have handed over that deed to save his own skin. Your parents would be on the street by Friday. The betrayal was structurally devastating. It robbed her of oxygen. Peter hadn't just been a coward at the altar, he was a parasite. He had planned to bleed her family dry. She looked down at the ridiculous white fabric bunching around her hips. She was a pathetic, trusting fool. "Why take me then?" Her voice cracked, and she hated the weakness in the sound. "If you have the deed." The claustrophobic proximity of the SUV made Cassian seem even larger as he turned toward her. "Because I don't want a 3-bedroom ranch in the suburbs, and because Peter insulted my intelligence. Taking the thing he was supposed to marry sends a message. So I'm a billboard. You're an asset," Cassian corrected smoothly. "One that will work off the debt. I have legitimate fronts, real estate shipping. I have a problem with inventory shrinkage at my docks. You manage logistics. You're going to fix it." Harley blinked. The sheer mundanity of the demand short-circuited her panic. "You kidnapped me to do an inventory audit. I repossessed you from a bad investment to secure my supply chain," he said, perfectly even. "Depending on how well you do it, we'll discuss your release." The SUV banked hard, the smell of brackish river water and diesel seeping through the air vents. Harley looked at the man beside her. He was terrifying, unyielding. But right now the monster was offering her a job instead of a grave. Peter would have ruined her family. Cassian had stopped it. Harley dropped the panic. Her cynical, stubborn brain kicked into gear. She straightened her spine, leaning slightly into his space. "If I do this," she said, keeping her voice steady, "if I fix your warehouse, you rip up the forged deed to my parents' house." Cassian watched the shift in her posture in the dim light. "Done. I want it in writing." A muscle feathered in his jaw. "My word is blood, Harley. Your word is a verbal contract with a hostage," she shot back. She dropped her synthetic lilies onto the floorboard between his expensive shoes. "I want it on paper." The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the tires on pockmarked asphalt. Slowly Cassian nodded. "Fine, on paper." He leaned closer, his scent of spearmint and gun oil filling her lungs. "But know this. If you try to run like Peter did, I won't just take the house. I'll burn it down." Harley met his dark gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I don't run," she said quietly. "I fix messes." Cassian's eyes darkened with something akin to respect. "Good, because your life is a massive mess right now." The SUV jerked to a halt inside a cavernous loading bay. Air brakes hissed from a nearby semi-truck, a violent expulsion of sound that made Harley flinch. Cassian pushed his door open. He didn't wait for her. He stepped out onto the oil-stained concrete, the heavy door thudding shut behind him. Harley sat in the frigid cabin for 3 seconds, letting the silence ring in her ears. She looked at the white tulle pooling around her hips. The bottom hem, once pristine, was now streaked with a thick smear of black grease from the doorframe. She shoved the door open. Getting out was worse than getting in. Her heels slipped on the slick concrete. She caught herself on the side panel of the SUV, her knuckles turning white. Cassian was already 10 yards away, talking to a man in a high-visibility vest, holding a clipboard. He didn't look back. He expected her to follow. Harley hitched the massive skirt up to her thighs, abandoning any pretense of modesty, and marched after him. The warehouse smelled of corrugated cardboard hot diesel and the sharp metallic tang of ozone. It was deafening. Forklifts beeped in frantic reversing rhythms. Men yelled over the din of conveyor belts. It was an ecosystem of organized chaos entirely removed from the quiet, floral-scented nightmare of St. Jude's. She followed Cassian up a flight of metal grate stairs. Her heels clanged against the iron. With every step, the boning of her bodice dug a new bruise into her ribcage. At the top of the stairs, Cassian pushed open a heavy fire door. The noise of the warehouse was instantly severed, replaced by the low, steady hum of central air conditioning. This was the office. It wasn't a smoke-filled back room with leather armchairs and bags of cash on the table. It looked exactly like the regional headquarters of a mid-sized paper supplier. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow over rows of grey cubicles. Telephones rang. People typed. A woman in a sensible beige cardigan looked up as they walked past her eyes, widening slightly at the sight of Harley, before dropping her gaze immediately back to her monitor. Cassian led her to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking the warehouse floor. He walked behind a massive, uncluttered oak desk and sat down in a high-backed, ergonomic chair. Harley stood in the doorway. She took up too much space. The dress made her a ridiculous white monument in a room defined by muted greys and deficiency. "Close the door," Cassian said. He was already pulling open a desk drawer. She kicked the door shut with her heel. It clicked, sealing them in. Cassian pulled a sheet of heavy stock company letterhead and a thick black fountain pen from the drawer. He didn't look at her as he began to write. The scratch of the nib against the paper was loud in the quiet room. Harley walked closer. She stopped on the opposite side of the desk, dropping the bundles of tools she'd been carrying. The fabric collapsed onto the industrial carpet with a weary sigh. "What is the name of the bank holding your parents' mortgage?" Cassian asked, his eyes focused on the paper. "First National," Harley said. Her voice sounded thin, tired. "Branch on Miller Street." Cassian nodded, once his hand moving in sharp, precise strokes across the page. He wrote for 2 minutes. Harley watched the line of his shoulders beneath his suit jacket. He wasn't tense. He was operating completely within his element, processing a problem and executing a solution. He flipped the pen closed, capped it, and slid the paper across the smooth oak surface. Harley leaned over. Her corset dug into her stomach. It was a contract, not a legal marvel, but an airtight, plainly worded agreement. It stated that upon the successful identification and resolution of the inventory deficit at Apex Logistics, the debt accrued by Peter, and specifically the collateral deed forged in the names of Thomas and Mary, would be considered null and void. Cassian had signed it at the bottom. The ink was still wet, a dark, gleaming blue. "Read it," he instructed. She did. Twice. Her logistical brain picked apart the phrasing, looking for loopholes. Define successful identification and resolution. Cassian leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together over his stomach. Find out who is stealing from me, how they are doing it, and plug the hole. You don't have to confront them. You just have to prove it with the numbers. And then you rip up the deed. And then I give you the deed, he corrected. You can rip it up yourself. Harley picked up the paper. The heavy stock felt solid in her hand. It was the only tangible proof that the last hour hadn't been a psychotic break. She folded it carefully, precisely, and wedged it into the tight space between her skin and the sweetheart neckline of her dress. Cassian's eyes tracked the movement. A muscle jumped in his jaw, but his expression remained a flat mask. "Now," Harley said, planting her hands on the edge of his desk, "if I am going to audit your warehouse, I need 2 things." Cassian raised an eyebrow. "You're making demands 10 minutes into your employment." "I am a hostage, negotiating working conditions," she fired back. "First, I need your ledger, all shipping manifests from the last 6 months, inbound and outbound. Second, I need a pair of pants." Cassian stared at her. The silence stretched. Outside the glass, a forklift dropped a pallet with a dull thud, shaking the floorboards beneath their feet. Slowly, Cassian reached for the desk phone. He pressed a single button. "Dom," he said into the speaker. "Go to the locker room. Bring a clean set of coveralls to my office, smallest size we have, and a pair of boots, size." He looked at Harley. 7, she said. 7. Cassian repeated, ending the call. He looked back up at her, leaning forward slightly, resting his forearms on the desk. "You're taking this remarkably well, Harley. My fiancée tried to sell my parents' house to the mob, and I am currently standing in a wedding dress covered in axle grease," she said, her tone dripping with exhaustion. "I am not taking it well. I am compartmentalizing so I don't start screaming and throwing your staplers at the glass. Do not confuse pragmatism with being okay." Cassian looked at her for a long time. The cold, assessing look in his dark eyes shifted into something slightly sharper. Respect. Noted, he said quietly. The coveralls were stiff navy blue canvas, smelling of industrial laundry detergent and dust. They were 3 sizes too big. Harley rolled the cuffs of the pants up 4 times and cinched the waist with a thick zip tie she found on a shelf in the women's locker room. She stood in front of the scratched mirror over the sinks. Taking off the wedding dress had been an ordeal. The zipper had jammed halfway down her spine, forcing her to contort her shoulders and pull the heavy garment over her head. Now the dress lay in a pathetic, crumpled heap in the corner of the bathroom, looking like a dead swan. Harley touched her ribs. The cheap boning of the corset had left harsh, angry red welts pressed deep into her skin. They throbbed in time with her pulse. She splashed cold water on her face, washing away the heavy setting spray-locked makeup her mother had paid a professional $200 to apply. She dried her face with a harsh paper towel. The woman staring back in the mirror looked pale, her hair falling out of its elaborate updo in a messy, pinned tangle. But she could breathe. The canvas was rough against her skin, but it was armor. She pushed out of the bathroom and walked back toward Cassian's office. The heavy steel-toed boots Dom had provided clomped heavily on the floor, a far cry from the delicate click of her heels. When she entered the office, Cassian was standing by a massive metal filing cabinet, pulling thick green-bound ledger books and slamming them onto a large conference table in the corner of the room. He glanced up as she walked in. His eyes swept over the oversized coveralls, the zip-tie belt, the messy hair. He didn't smile, but the hard lines around his mouth eased slightly. "Very fashionable," he said, dropping the last ledger onto the pile. "There's coffee in the break room down the hall. Black." "I don't need coffee. I need data." Harley walked to the table. She pulled out a chair and sat down the canvas, bunching uncomfortably behind her knees. She dragged the top ledger toward her, opening it to a random page in the middle. Columns of numbers, dates, vendor codes. It was exactly the same boring, tedious language she spoke 40 hours a week at her own job. Cassian walked over and stood behind her chair. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to smell the spearmint again. It made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "The shrinkage is in the high-value electronics," Cassian said, his voice dropping slightly, the vibration of it traveling down her spine. "Microchips processors, small boxes, high yield. They come in off the cargo ships from overseas, hit this warehouse to be sorted, and by the time the outbound trucks reach their destinations in the Midwest, we are light by 10 to 15%. Harley picked up a pen from the table. She didn't look back at him. She stared at the numbers. "Who tracks the manifests when the shipping containers are cracked open? The dock foreman. And who inputs that data into this ledger? The floor managers." Harley flipped back 30 pages, scanning the dates. She cross-referenced a serial number with a receiving date. Her eyes darted down the column, her pen hovering over the paper. "Your problem isn't on the outbound trucks," she said, her voice dropping into a steady, flat cadence of pure focus. Cassian shifted closer. He rested one hand on the back of her chair. "Why? Because if someone was skimming 10% off a loaded truck, the weight station logs wouldn't match the bills of lading when they cross state lines. The drivers would get flagged by the Department of Transportation immediately. You'd have trucks impounded." She tapped the pen against a column on the page. "No, the cargo isn't vanishing on the road. It's vanishing before it ever gets put on a truck." Cassian leaned over her shoulder to look at where she was pointing. "The manifests show the containers are full when they arrive here." "Paper lies," Harley said cynically. "I can write down that I received 500 pallets of gold bullion. It doesn't mean it's in the building." She dragged the ledger across the table, placing it next to a thinner, blue-bound book. This is your inbound log. This is your storage index. Look at the timestamps. Cassian's eyes narrowed as he traced the line she was pointing to. A shipping container arrives at Dock 4 at 2 a.m. Harley explained, her finger tracing the ink. The floor manager logs the inventory into the holding cages at 4:30 a.m. 2.5 hours to unload and catalogue a single container. That's slow, even with a skeleton night crew. It happens, Cassian said defensively. Equipment breaks down. People take breaks. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Harley challenged, flipping 3 pages forward. Same docking bay, same 2.5-hour gap. But on Mondays and Wednesdays, it takes 45 minutes to clear the exact same volume. Cassian went entirely still. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He wasn't looking at the paper anymore. He was staring at the blank space of the table, his mind working violently fast, connecting the dots she had just laid out. They're not stealing it off the floor. Cassian muttered, his voice cold and hard. They're diverting it before it's officially checked into the system. The container arrives. A pallet gets pulled off, wheeled straight out a side door to a waiting van, and then the rest of the cargo is officially scanned into the warehouse holding area. Harley concluded, leaning back in her chair, the canvas coveralls scratched against her skin. Your floor manager is cooking the time logs to cover the gap. The product isn't missing. According to your own system, it never arrived in the first place. Cassian slowly stood up straight. He looked down at her. She was a woman in an ill-fitting uniform with a zip-tie belt, her face pale and exhausted. But she had just solved a leak that had cost him $500,000 in 2 months, and she had done it in 12 minutes. "Who is the manager on duty Tuesday nights?" Harley asked, spinning the pen between her fingers. Cassian's jaw tightened. "A guy named Miller." Harley closed the ledger with a heavy thud. The sound echoed in the quiet office. "Then I suggest you have a very polite conversation with Mr. Miller about his time management skills." She looked up at Cassian, expecting to see the terrifying, dead-eyed mob boss who had hauled Peter up by his throat in the church. Instead, he was looking at her with a heavy, intense focus that made her lungs constrict. He wasn't looking at a hostage anymore. "I'll handle Miller," Cassian said quietly. "Keep reading. Find out who else is helping him." Cassian left the office without another word. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing Harley back into the refrigerated silence of the room. For a long time she just stared at the frosted glass. The warehouse floor below continued its chaotic ballet forklifts, reversing men, shouting over the roar of diesel engines. They didn't know what was happening in the administrative wing. They didn't know their boss had just walked out with the specific chilling intent to ruin a man's life over a discrepancy in a green ledger. Harley looked down at her hands. They were shaking slightly, a delayed tremor from the adrenaline spike. She forced them flat against the cool oak of the desk. Compartmentalize. She had made a deal. She was a logistics manager. She looked at numbers. She found the pattern. She delivered the report. What happened after the report was submitted was entirely above her pay grade. She pulled the second ledger toward her. The outbound logs. If Miller was skimming the high-value electronics off the inbound containers, he wasn't carrying them out in his lunchbox. Microchips were small, but $500,000 worth of processors required volume. He needed a transport method. Harley dug in. The fluorescent lights hummed a high, irritating pitch above her head. Her eyes began to burn, the numbers blurring into solid green lines, but she refused to stop. She cross-referenced Tuesday and Thursday night shifts with the maintenance logs for the warehouse's delivery vans. 45 minutes later, she found it. Every Tuesday and Thursday night, a specific cargo van vehicle designation, V14, was logged out for routine preventative maintenance, by a fleet mechanic named Harding. The van was out of service for exactly 3 hours. The exact 3 hours Miller was slow-walking the dock shipments. Harley sat back, the canvas coveralls hitched up uncomfortably at her crotch. She yanked them down with an annoyed grunt. 2 names, Miller and Harding. A closed-loop system of theft. The door handle turned. Harley stiffened. Cassian walked in. He moved differently than he had an hour ago. The tightly coiled professional energy was gone, replaced by a loose, heavy exhaustion that felt distinctly predatory. He had taken his suit jacket off. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the purple tie yanked entirely free and missing. He didn't look at her. He walked straight past the conference table to a small, wet bar in the corner of the office. He turned the heavy chrome faucet, letting the water run cold. Harley watched him. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled up past his elbows, exposing thick forearms corded with muscle and dusted with dark hair. There was a faint, bruised purple swelling across the knuckles of his right hand. And then the smell hit her. It cut through the sterile air conditioning and the lingering scent of his spearmint cologne. It was sharp, metallic, and warm. Copper. It was the unmistakable primal scent of blood. Harley's stomach gave a violent, sickening lurch. The pragmatic wall she had built in her mind cracked right down the middle. She tasted bile at the back of her throat. Cassian plunged his hands under the running water. He grabbed a bar of abrasive pumice soap and began to scrub. The water swirling down the stainless steel drain turned a faint, watery pink for exactly 3 seconds before running clear again. He dried his hands on a paper towel, his back still to her. Miller had a sudden crisis of conscience, Cassian said to the sink. His voice was gravelly, scraped, raw. He decided to seek alternative employment. Harley gripped the edge of the table. "Is he dead?" The words tasted like ash. Cassian turned around. He tossed the damp paper towel into a trash can. His dark eyes locked onto hers, flat and completely devoid of empathy. "I told you I run a legitimate business front. Dead bodies in the loading bay are bad for OSHA compliance." He walked slowly back to the desk, leaning against the edge, crossing his arms over his chest. He has 2 broken hands. He won't be writing any more forged time logs. He gave up his partner before I even asked the first question. "Harding." Harley breathed out her voice, barely a whisper. Cassian paused. The coldness in his eyes fractured, replaced by a sharp flare of surprise. He uncrossed his arms. "You found the mechanic." "Vehicle V14, Harley said, forcing her voice to steady. She tapped the open ledger. "Logged out for maintenance every time Miller was on the dock. It's the transport vehicle." Cassian stared at her. He looked at the ledger, then back at her pale, exhausted face. The bruise-like shadows under her eyes were stark against her skin. She looked like she had been dragged behind a truck wearing a janitor's uniform held together by a zip tie. But her mind was razor-sharp. "You did that in under an hour," he said quietly. "It's basic data correlation," Harley replied, leaning back in her chair, putting distance between herself and the faint, lingering smell of copper on his skin. "They were greedy, not smart." Cassian reached out and slowly closed the ledger. "Dom is picking up Harding now. The leak is plugged. Then the audit is complete." Harley swallowed hard, looking directly at the spot on his shirt, where a single microscopic red speck stained the white cotton near his ribs. "Which means the contract is fulfilled." Cassian followed her gaze. He looked down at his shirt, then back up at her. "Yes. I want the deed, Cassian." He didn't flinch at her use of his first name. He walked around the desk, opened the heavy bottom drawer, and pulled out a manila envelope. He tossed it onto the center of the conference table. It landed with a soft, authoritative slap. Harley didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, snatching the envelope. She tore the flap open, her fingernail snagging on the thick paper. She pulled out the document. It was the original deed to the single-story ranch house in Elmwood. At the bottom, she saw the shaky, obvious forgeries of her mother's and father's signatures next to Peter's cramped handwriting. Her breath hitched. A sound escaped her throat, not a sob, but a broken, jagged exhale of pure, unadulterated relief. The terrifying weight that had been sitting on her chest since the altar finally shattered. Her parents were safe. Peter's cowardice wouldn't ruin them. She folded the heavy parchment in half, then in quarters, ignoring the way the crease ruined the official seal. She shoved it deep into the breast pocket of the canvas coveralls, right over her heart. When she finally looked up, Cassian was watching her. He wasn't gloating. He was just observing her, reading the violent shift in her body language as the adrenaline finally began to drain away. "Rip it up when you get home," he said. "I'll burn it." She corrected her voice, thick. Cassian nodded once. "Good." The adrenaline crash didn't ease in. It hit Harley like a physical blow to the back of the knees. The moment she secured the deed in her pocket, the fight-or-flight chemicals keeping her upright evaporated. Her vision swam. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights morphed into a physical ache pulsing behind her eyes. Her shoulders slumped the oversized canvas coveralls, suddenly feeling like they weighed 50 pounds. She gripped the edge of the conference table, swaying slightly. Her knuckles were white, the joints aching from the tension she had been holding for the last 4 hours. Cassian took a step forward. "Sit down." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. Harley didn't argue. Her knees buckled, and she dropped heavily back into the desk chair. She let her head fall forward, resting her forehead against the cool, smooth surface of the wooden table. The wood smelled faintly of lemon polish and dust. It was the most comforting thing she had experienced all day. "What time is it?" she mumbled into the table. 10:15. Cassian's voice came from somewhere above her. 10:15. Her reception was supposed to end at 11. Right now, she should have been dancing to an overplayed pop song, drinking cheap champagne, and ignoring the pinch of her heels. Instead, she was sitting in a mob boss's office, wearing a mechanic's uniform, carrying a forged property deed. A dry, hacking laugh tore its way out of her throat. It sounded deranged. She clamped a hand over her mouth, but another harsh chuckle slipped through her fingers. Cassian didn't ask what was funny. He walked over to the desk phone and pressed a button. "Dom, bring the car around to the private garage. We're leaving." Harley lifted her head. The room spun sluggishly. "Leaving where?" "You're falling apart," Cassian stating a fact rather than offering an insult. "You can't walk, let alone drive. I'm taking you to a secure location." "No." Harley forced herself to sit up straight, wincing as the raw skin on her rib cage ground against the stiff canvas. "No secure location. The deal is done. You said I could go." "I said I would give you the deed." Cassian corrected his tone, evening out into that maddening, unyielding calm. "And I did. But Peter is still out there. He ran. He knows you were taken. If he thinks you have the deed, or if he thinks you have leverage, he might come looking for you to save his own skin again." Harley stared at him, her tired brain struggling to process the logic. "Peter is a coward. He's not going to come after me." "Cowards are the most dangerous people in the world, Harley," Cassian said quietly. "They don't act on logic. They act on panic. They shoot blindly in the dark. Until I find Peter and settle his debt, you are a loose end." So I traded one hostage situation for another. She rubbed her eyes aggressively, trying to scrape the exhaustion out of her retinas. "Fantastic. You traded a death sentence for a guest room," he countered. He walked over to her chair. He didn't grab her wrist this time. He just stood there, a massive, immovable obstacle demanding her compliance. "Stand up, Harley, or I will carry you, and I guarantee you won't like it." She believed him. With a groan that she didn't bother to suppress, she pushed herself up from the chair. The heavy, steel-toed boots felt like cement blocks on her feet. She took one step, swayed, and immediately pitched sideways. Cassian caught her. His hand shot out, gripping her upper arm. His grip was entirely different from the brutal hold in the church. It was firm, anchoring, but it didn't bruise. He pulled her against his side, letting his larger frame absorb her weight. He smelled of soap now. The copper scent was gone, washed down the drain, but the memory of it lingered in the back of Harley's throat. "Lean on me," he instructed. "I'm fine," she lied, automatically trying to pull away. Cassian tightened his grip completely, ignoring her protest. "Stop fighting me. You won. Let it go for 5 minutes." The word struck a nerve she didn't know was exposed. You won. She had saved her parents. She had survived the worst day of her life through sheer stubborn competence. The overwhelming urge to just let someone else hold the weight, even for a second, was intoxicating. She stopped pulling away. She let her shoulder slump against his ribs. He was solid, unyielding, as a brick wall radiating heat through the thin cotton of his shirt. Cassian didn't say anything else. He half-led, half-carried her out of the office. They bypassed the main warehouse floor, walking down a narrow, dimly lit concrete corridor that smelled intensely of damp earth and old exhaust. They emerged into a small enclosed concrete garage. The black SUV was idling Dom, sitting stoically in the driver's seat. Cassian opened the rear door. He helped her climb in. She didn't have to wrestle with tool and petticoats this time. She just sank into the black leather, her exhausted muscles turning to liquid. Cassian slid in beside her, closing the door. The cabin plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow of the streetlights, filtering through the heavily tinted windows as the garage door rolled up. "Where are my clothes?" Harley asked, her voice thick with sleep. "My dress." "In a trash bag in the back," Cassian said, staring straight ahead as the SUV pulled out into the deserted industrial streets. It was ruined. It was expensive. It was cheap lace, he corrected softly. Harley didn't have the energy to argue. She closed her eyes. The gentle rocking of the heavy vehicle over the pavement was a sedative. She didn't want to sleep next to a man who broke bones in a warehouse. She wanted to stay alert. She wanted to plan her next move. But her body betrayed her. Her head lolled to the side. It didn't hit the cold glass of the window. It hit the firm, warm expanse of Cassian's shoulder. She tensed, expecting him to shove her away to demand physical distance. Cassian didn't move. He didn't shift his weight. He sat perfectly still in the darkness, letting the woman in the oversized coveralls use him as a pillow. "Go to sleep, Harley," he said, his gravelly voice vibrating through his chest and against her cheek. "I've got the watch." Harley woke to the smell of roasting coffee beans and rain. For 3 seconds, her brain served up the familiar, comforting lie of her old life. She was in her apartment. It was Wednesday. She needed to pull the chicken breasts out of the freezer to thaw. Then she tried to roll over. Her ribcage screamed a sharp scraping ache that flared precisely where the cheap plastic boning of her wedding corset had dug into her skin for 6 hours. The memory of the day crashed over her in a suffocating wave. Peter's retreating back, the suffocating heat of the church, the cold leather of the SUV, the metallic tang of blood in the warehouse office. She opened her eyes. She wasn't in her apartment. She was lying in a massive bed with a heavy charcoal-grey duvet. The sheets beneath her weren't her cheap cotton blends. They were heavy, icy linen. The room was aggressively minimalist. Bare white walls, dark walnut floors, and a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a dense, rain-slicked pine forest. It didn't look like a mobster's hideout. It looked like an architectural digest spread for a reclusive tech billionaire. She looked down at herself. The stiff, oversized canvas coveralls were gone. Someone had dressed her in a massive, obscenely soft black t-shirt that fell to her mid-thigh. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She threw off the duvet and swung her legs over the edge of the mattress. Her bare feet hit the cold walnut planks. She patted her chest, her hands, frantic, until she felt the heavy fold of the manila envelope sitting on the bedside table next to a glass of water. The forged deed. She exhaled a shaky breath, sinking back onto the edge of the mattress. Her hands were trembling again. The adrenaline was entirely gone, leaving behind a hollow, bruised exhaustion that settled deep into her marrow. Harley stood up. Her legs felt like they were made of damp sand. She bypassed the sprawling master bathroom and walked toward the heavy oak door leading to the rest of the house. The house was vast, quiet, and dominated by concrete and glass. She followed the scent of coffee down a wide hallway, her bare feet making no sound. She found Cassian in the kitchen. It was a stark, industrial space of stainless steel and black marble. He was standing by a massive espresso machine, wearing faded grey sweatpants and a tight black t-shirt that stretched over the heavy muscle of his back. He didn't have the suit on. He didn't have the polished veneer of a dangerous businessman. With his hair slightly messy and the shadow of morning stubble darkening his jaw, he looked raw. "Ruffer, you snore," he said. He didn't turn around. He just reached up and pulled a second ceramic mug from a floating shelf. Harley stopped in the doorway. "I do not." "You do. It's a localized aggressive hum, like a dying refrigerator." He turned, holding out the mug. Steam curled from the dark liquid. Black. She crossed the kitchen floor. The stone tiles were freezing. She took the mug, careful not to let her fingers brush his. The heat of the ceramic seeped into her cold palms. She took a sip. It was bitter strong, and exactly what she needed to clear the fog from her brain. "Where are we?" she asked, leaning her hip against the cool marble of the island. "My property in the Catskills," Cassian replied, leaning back against the counter opposite her. "About 2 hours north of the city. You slept through the drive." Harley stared into her coffee. 2 hours. She was utterly isolated. "Who changed my clothes?" "My housekeeper, Maria. She comes in on Wednesdays." She wasn't thrilled about the canvas coveralls. Mumbled something in Italian about me lacking basic human decency. The tension in Harley's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. She took another longer drink of the coffee. "I need my phone. My parents. They saw me get into a car with a man who threatened to kill Peter. They probably called the police." Cassian reached into his pocket and placed her phone on the marble island. It was fully charged. "I had Dom pull the battery yesterday so they couldn't track the signal. I put it back in an hour ago. You have 47 missed calls. Mostly your mother." Harley picked it up. The screen lit up with a barrage of notifications. The sheer volume of panic trapped inside the little glass rectangle made her stomach twist. "Call them," Cassian said, his voice flat. "Tell them Peter panicked and left you at the altar, and you took off with an old friend to process the embarrassment. Tell them you're safe, you're not coming home today, and they shouldn't speak to the police, because it will only humiliate you further." It was a perfectly constructed lie. It preyed exactly on her mother's obsession with social appearances. "And what if I tell them the truth?" Harley asked, looking up at him, testing the boundary. Cassian's dark eyes met hers. The relaxed morning ease vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating predator she had met in the church. "Then I have to send Dom to have a very impolite conversation with the detectives. and your parents find out they were 24 hours away from being homeless. You saved them, Harley. Don't ruin it by trying to be honest. He was right. It was a bitter, jagged pill to swallow, but he was right. She unlocked her phone and dialed. Her mother answered on the first ring, hysterical. Harley walked away from the kitchen island, pacing the length of the floor-to-ceiling windows. She stared out at the rain hitting the pine needles as she delivered the lie, her voice flat and deadened. She listened to her mother cry, then pivot to complaining about the wasted catering deposit. She listened to her father sigh in the background. She absorbed their chaos, completely detached from it. "I'm fine, Mum. I'll call you tomorrow," Harley finally said, cutting off a rant about the florist. She ended the call. She stood by the window for a long time. The glass was cold against her forehead. Her old life felt 1,000,000 miles away, separated by a chasm she couldn't jump back across. Peter had destroyed the bridge. Cassian had burned the remains. She turned back to the kitchen. Cassian was still standing there watching her. He hadn't moved. "Better?" he asked. "I just lied to my mother about being kidnapped by a cartel boss," Harley said dryly. "I feel incredibly well-adjusted." Cassian let out that short, sharp exhale, his version of a laugh. "I'm not the cartel, Harley. I'm the guy the cartel owes money to." Semantics. She walked back to the island and set her empty mug down. "What happens now?" "Now," Cassian said, pushing off the counter. "We deal with Peter." 30 minutes later, the heavy front door of the house opened. Dom walked in his black suit, dripping rainwater onto the pristine walnut floors. He carried a battered leather briefcase. He walked into the kitchen, nodding once at Harley before turning to Cassian. "We found him." Harley's breath hitched. Her hands tightened on the edge of the marble island. Cassian didn't look surprised. "Where?" "Greyhound station in Albany. Trying to buy a ticket to Montreal with a prepaid debit card." Dom set the briefcase on the counter and popped the brass latches. "He's in the trunk of the second car." The kitchen went dead silent. The only sound was the heavy drumming of rain against the glass. Harley felt a sudden, terrifying rush of vertigo. In the trunk, the sterile, organized reality of the house shattered, revealing the violence lurking just beneath the floorboards. She looked at Cassian. His face was entirely unreadable. "Bring him to the garage," Cassian ordered. Dom nodded and turned to leave. "Wait," Harley said. The word tore out of her throat before she could stop it. Both men looked at her. She didn't know what she was doing. She hated Peter. He had humiliated her, betrayed her, and tried to sell her parents' lives to save his own skin. He deserved whatever was coming to him in that garage. But if she let Cassian kill him, she became complicit. The blood would be on her hands, too. "Cassian," Harley said, her voice shaking slightly, but she forced her chin up, meeting his flat, dark stare. "You said you didn't want messy. You said dead bodies are bad for business. I said they were bad for OSHA compliance in my warehouse," Cassian corrected softly. "This is private property. He's not worth it." Harley stepped around the island, putting herself between Cassian and the hallway. "He's pathetic. If he disappears, the police will look at me. The jilted bride. They'll look at the missing money. It brings heat you don't need." Cassian tilted his head, studying her. He stepped closer. The sheer size of him, the quiet, radiating threat was overwhelming. "He owes me $2.5 million. He owes you for the humiliation. You want me to just let him get on a bus to Canada?" "No," Harley said, her logistical brain kicking into overdrive, finding the cold, pragmatic solution. "I want you to ruin him. You have the forged deed. You have proof of fraud. Send it to the feds. Send his illegal investment records to the SEC. Bankrupt him. Put him in a federal prison For white-collar crime. It recoups your money when they seize his assets, and he spends the next 20 years in a concrete box thinking about it. Cassian stared at her. The silence stretched heavy and thick with tension. He looked at the pulse, jumping frantically at the base of her throat, then up to the hard, unyielding set of her jaw. Slowly the corner of his mouth twitched upward. It wasn't a smile. It was a recognition. He looked at Dom over her shoulder. Take him out of the trunk. Give him his prepaid card. Tell him if I ever see his face south of the Canadian border again, I won't bother with the trunk. Dom didn't question the order. He just nodded and walked out. Harley let out a long, shaky exhale, her knees suddenly feeling weak. She grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself. Cassian reached over to the stove. He picked up a heavy silver Zippo lighter that had been sitting near the burners. He flipped the lid with a sharp clink and struck the flint. A bright orange flame flared to life. He held it out toward her. You have something to do, he said. Harley reached into the pocket of the oversized t-shirt. She pulled out the folded manila envelope. Her fingers were steady now. She walked over to the deep stainless steel sink. She pulled the forged deed out of the envelope. She didn't read it again. She didn't want to see Peter's cramped handwriting. She held the thick parchment over the sink and took the lighter from Cassian. She touched the flame to the bottom corner of the paper. It caught quickly. The fire crawled up the edges, turning the white paper into curling black ash. The smell of burning paper and ozone filled the kitchen, wiping out the scent of the coffee. Harley watched it burn until the heat licked at her fingertips. She dropped the flaming remnants into the sink. They hissed against the damp metal, dissolving into a pile of dark, fragile cinders. Cassian reached over and turned on the faucet. The water washed the ashes down the drain, leaving the stainless steel perfectly clean. Debt paid, Cassian said quietly. He took the lighter from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. His skin was rough, warm. He didn't step back. He stayed close, crowding her against the counter. You're free to go, Harley, he said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating in the quiet kitchen. Dom can drive you back to the city. You can go back to your warehouse, your spreadsheets, your $55,000 a year. You can pretend yesterday never happened. Harley looked up at him. She thought about her cubicle. She thought about the endless, numbing routine of her life before yesterday. And then she thought about the electric, terrifying clarity she had felt sitting in his office, dismantling a $500,000 theft in under an hour. She didn't want to go back. The realization was horrifying, but it was absolute. Safe was an illusion. Safe was Peter, leaving her at the altar. And if I don't want to go back? She asked. The words tasted like ash and copper. Cassian's eyes darkened, the black irises swallowing the room. He reached up, tracing a single calloused finger along the collarbone, exposed by the oversized collar of her shirt, lingering right above the faint bruise the corset had left behind. Then you stay, he murmured, his thumb brushing her pulse point. I need a head of logistics. Someone who doesn't panic. Someone who burns the evidence. He leaned in his mouth, hovering inches from hers. The scent of him, spearmint, dark coffee, and that underlying, dangerous heat wrapped around her. But understand this, Harley, he whispered. If you stay, you're not collateral anymore. You're mine. Harley didn't pull away. She reached up her hand, wrapping around his thick wrist, anchoring herself to the storm. Show me the ledgers, she said.